Late afternoon, early November 1881. The Montana Territory lay under the muted gold-gray light that came when winter was closing in. Wet snow clung heavy to the branches of pine and spruce, the white weaving through deep green, like a quilt sagging under its own weight. The forest and the small clearing beyond it were so still that the faint whistle of wind between the needles seemed like the only sound in the world. In the middle of that clearing stood the skeleton of a half-built cabin. Pine logs had been stacked into rough, steady walls that barely reached shoulder height, leaving gaps wide enough for the wind to pass through unhindered. Eleanor Sullivan, her frame lean but her hands strong, hefted a heavy timber onto the wall frame. Each strike of her hammer landed with a dry, ringing thud, the sound drifting into the cold air alongside the white plume of her breath. Beneath her worn coat, her belly rounded forward, clear proof of the life growing inside her. She had been working alone for weeks, seeing no one except the Kowalskis, who had brought her a sack of flour and a warning about early snow. Out here, winter didn't wait for anyone. If the cabin wasn't finished before the first blizzard rolled in, she'd pay for it in long freezing nights and an empty stomach. But to Eleanor, this wasn't just shelter. This was her shield, her declaration, her proof that she could build a new life far from everything she'd left behind in the East. The sudden rhythm of hoofbeats broke the stillness. From between the tall pines, a rider emerged, dark against the pale snow, his bay gelding pawing at the icy ground. His long coat swayed with the horse's movement, and the brim of his hat shadowed his face, revealing only the steady, measured gaze of a man used to open country and silence. "Ma'am," he called out, voice low, with the faint drawl of someone shaped by horses and distance. "Thought this place was abandoned. Seems I was wrong." Eleanor froze, one hand bracing her lower back, the other still wrapped around the hammer's handle. She turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "This land's mine. If you're lost, head west. There's nothing for you here." The man tipped his hat. "No trouble meant. Name's Clayton Hartwell. Circle H Ranch, 10 miles north." His eyes flicked over the half-finished cabin, then down to her worn leather gloves. "Didn't expect to find someone building alone, especially not in your condition." Eleanor's grip on the hammer tightened. "I didn't come here to fit anyone's idea of most women." The wind carried the scent of pine sap and snow between them, while their eyes hers, sharp with caution, his steady with curiosity, locked in the kind of silence where neither side was ready to step forward or back. Clayton swung down from his saddle with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He led the bay gelding a few steps closer, but kept a respectful distance, his boots crunching over the frost-hardened grass. No offense meant, he set his eyes taking in the rough-hewn seams of the walls, the empty frame where a door might be. "It's just, most women don't do this kind of work, especially not while carrying a child." Eleanor raised the hammer again, driving the nail in with a firm, steady rhythm. The metallic ring punctuated her words. "I didn't come here to please anyone's expectations. I came here to start over." Clayton stood watching her for a moment longer, his gaze not invasive but searching. Then he lifted his hand slightly, palms out a silent sign that he meant no harm. "Just thought you might need a hand, lifting some of the heavier logs," he offered. "Raising a cabin and a baby at the same time. That takes grit." "What I have is grit," Eleanor said flatly. She bent, hoisted another timber onto her shoulder, and moved toward the wall. Her pace was slower now, her movements weighted by the child beneath her ribs, but she didn't waver. "What I don't have is time for charity. If you've come to offer pity, take it back to Circle H." The wind swept through the open gaps in the wall, bringing with it the resinous scent of pine. Clayton studied her stance, the squared shoulders, the lifted chin, and understood she wasn't simply stubborn. She was someone who had carried too much for too long, and had learned to stand on her own, because no one else would. "Not pity," he said finally, voice lower. "Just respect." Eleanor paused mid-swing, finishing the nail before turning to look at him properly for the first time. He had the bearing of a man raised with comforts, but there were lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of loss, and his hands, though clean, were calloused from work. Most striking was the flicker in his expression, an unspoken understanding she hadn't seen in a long time. "I've had enough of people who want to fix things," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "I'm not broken. I'm building." Clayton nodded once. "Fair enough. Just thought you ought to know if you change your mind. The Circle H isn't far." Without waiting for a reply, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off into the trees. Eleanor watched him disappear until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the wind. Only then did she lean against the wall for a breath, one hand pressed lightly over her belly. The child within shifted, and she murmured under her breath, "That's not the kind of man who passes through by accident." 3 days later, the morning sun hung low, throwing long shadows across the frozen prairie. Eleanor stood at the side of her half-built cabin, a rough-hewn pine plank balanced against her shoulder. Her lower back throbbed with every breath, her fingers stiff from cold and labor. The crunch of hooves came from the edge of the clearing. She turned just as Clayton Hartwell emerged from between the snow-dusted aspens. He looked less formal today. No vest, no gloves, just a wool coat and the kind of steady gaze that seemed to see too much. In his arms he carried a bundle wrapped in a checkered cloth. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said, not as a scolding, but as a plain truth. He stepped forward and set the bundle on a stump. "My mother sent this tea for nausea and some baby clothes she knitted. Said you'd probably pretend you didn't need them, but sent them anyway." Eleanor's eyes lingered on the bundle, but she didn't move toward it. Clayton's gaze traveled briefly over the cabin walls, higher now, with a chimney taking shape before returning to her. "You've done all this yourself, every nail," she answered shortly. "Impressive," he said, and his eyes dropped to her hands, chapped, reddened from the cold. "Painful, too, I'd imagine." Eleanor crossed her arms, bracing herself against both the chill and something warmer she didn't want to feel. "Why are you really here, Mr. Hartwell slumming? For a story to tell your mother?" Clayton didn't flinch. "I came because I wanted to, and because I don't like the thought of you working through pain alone when it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not a charity case. I never said you were." Her voice tightened. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. Men like you offer help as if it's some sort of blessing, but it always comes with a price. Expectations, judgments." He let her words hang in the frosty air, then said quietly, "Some people offer help not because they think you're weak, but because they admire your strength." She blinked, caught off guard. "I've seen people fold under far less than what you're carrying," he went on. "But you're here building something real with no one watching and no one clapping. That's not weakness. That's rare." Eleanor's throat felt dry. "I won't stay," Clayton added, nodding toward the bundle. "Just thought you could use the tea, and a reminder that not everyone who shows up is here to fix or claim you." Her eyes flicked to the bundle again, then back to him. The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than any flirtation could have. "You can leave it there," she said finally. He nodded, once turned, and walked back toward the trees. She didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Only then did she open the cloth, 3 tiny yellow wool garments stitched with care, and a tin of tea smelling faintly of ginger and mint. Something in her chest cracked open, not enough to fall apart, but enough to feel. Rumors traveled faster than stagecoaches in Willowbrook. At first they were about the woman living alone in the wilderness, too proud to accept charity, too stubborn to fit into society's mold. But soon the whispers sharpened, focusing on Clayton Hartwell, the respected rancher's son seen riding south too often and staying too long near a half-built cabin. On a morning when the ground was hard as stone and the air bit like glass, a black carriage rolled into Eleanor's clearing. Its wheels crunched over the frost, the lacquered body gleaming even in the weak winter light. A woman stepped down, with the grace of someone who had been taught to own any room she entered. Her coat was fine imported wool, her gloves pale lambskin, her hair twisted into an elaborate knot that spoke of parlors and servants. "Miss Sullivan," she said crisply, adjusting her skirt as her eyes swept over the modest porch. "I am Victoria Morrison. I imagine my name has reached you, if not formally." Eleanor straightened her hand instinctively, resting over the swell of her belly. "I know of you." Victoria's gaze moved from the cabin's unpainted walls to the sawdust by the steps, then back to Eleanor. "Then I'll be brief. Whatever this arrangement is between you and Mr. Hartwell, it needs to end. There is no arrangement." "Then end the association," Victoria replied, without missing a beat. "He visits often. People talk. His family's name is being dragged through parlors from Willowbrook to Helena, and my fiancée is hesitating to set a wedding date." Eleanor's voice was calm but firm. "He's a free man, Miss Morrison. I never asked him to come, and I never sent him away either." Victoria's smile was tight-brittle. "You let him stay. You let him help. And now the town wonders if he's fathering another man's child." Heat flushed Eleanor's face, but her voice held steady. "I built this cabin alone. I split my own firewood. I sewed clothes for a child who will never know the comfort of legitimacy in the eyes of people like you. I've asked nothing of your fiancé. Not enough," Victoria snapped, "because your presence still haunts him, and your silence lets the world imagine the worst. Leave. Sell the land. Go east or vanish into some other town that will take a woman in your situation. But do not stay here, not where he can see you. Not where his future is being whittled away, one scandalous story at a time." Eleanor's nails dug into her palms. "You do not own him. I know how this world works," Victoria said sharply. "Men fall in love with the idea of strength wrapped in suffering. But they marry respectability. Make it easier on all of us before this ends worse." When the carriage wheels vanished into the forest, silence returned, but it felt heavier now. Eleanor stood unmoving on the porch, the cold biting through her shawl, her breath ragged. Later she would boil tea and feel the baby kick. But for now, she stood rooted in place, the question echoing in her mind. Am I destroying the only good man who ever looked at me without pity? Snow drifted down in thick, steady flakes, softening the outlines of the cabin and muffling the world. Days had passed since Victoria Morrison's visit, yet her words lingered like a splinter Eleanor couldn't dig out. Each gust of wind seemed to carry the possibility of hoofbeats, and she didn't know if she hoped for them or dreaded them. That afternoon they came. She opened the door before Clayton could knock. Snow clung to his coat and the brim of his hat. His cheeks flushed from cold, but his eyes were clear and certain. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to talk to you. You shouldn't be here." "I should be exactly here," he countered, stepping inside. The firelight flickered over his face as he pulled off his gloves. "I went home and told my father the engagement with Victoria is over. I told him I won't marry a life I don't believe in. He threatened to cut me off, called me a fool. But I didn't back down." Eleanor's breath caught. "Clayton," he raised a hand, stopping her. "I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because you need to understand. This isn't pity or rebellion or some romantic fancy. This is me choosing what's real. You. This place. That child." The flames popped in the hearth, filling the silence between them. Eleanor turned towards the fire, folding her arms across her belly, as if to shield both herself and the life inside from what he was saying. "You can't throw away your future over a scandal." "I'm not throwing anything away," he replied. "I'm building something new." Her voice dropped. "There's something you don't know. Something I should have told you from the beginning." He waited. "I'm not divorced," she said quietly. "Legally, I'm still married to Charles Whitmore, the man who left the moment I told him I was expecting. I thought it was over. I left Boston with the papers unsigned, believing he would file them. But no document ever came, and I didn't have the strength to chase it down. I just wanted to disappear." Clayton's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. Eleanor turned to him, now her eyes heavy with guilt. I'm not a widow. I'm not free. In the eyes of the law, I'm still another man's wife. And you deserve to know that before you ruin your life for someone who can't give you anything in return." He stepped forward until he was right in front of her, then took her hands, rough, calloused hands that had built a home from nothing. "You think this changes how I feel?" She tried to pull back, but he held firm, gentle, but unyielding. "It only makes me want to fight harder for you. You've endured more than most could bear, and you're still standing. That's not a burden. That's courage." Outside, snow swirled in the wind. Inside, his words landed like a promise. The sky had turned the color of lead by morning, heavy and low. The wind hissed through the pines in long warning breaths, rattling the half-frozen branches. Eleanor stood on the porch, one hand gripping the railing, the other resting on the firm swell of her belly. The baby had been restless all morning, shifting low, kicking sharp, as if it too sensed something was coming. By midday, the first flakes began to fall, big fat wet snow that clung to her shawl. Within the hour, the world was swallowed in white. She shut the door against the cold and began her quiet preparations, water heating on the stove. Clean linens folded by the hearth lamps lit against the dimming day. The first contraction hit like a flash of fire, stealing her breath and bending her double. She braced herself against the table, eyes wide. "Not now," she whispered. But the second came quicker, harder. Miles away, Clayton was tightening the cinch on his best horse, the sky already a whirling haze. Some instinct sharper than logic told him she needed him now. He swung into the saddle and urged the gelding into the storm. The wind screamed across the open ground, cutting into his face like knives. Snow lashed his coat, obscuring the path. He leaned low, urging the horse on, but in the whiteout the trail vanished. His mount stumbled on a hidden drift, lost footing on a patch of ice, and went down. Clayton was thrown hard, the breath knocked from his lungs as he landed in a shallow creek. The shock of icy water stole what little air he had left. Pain flared white-hot in his shoulder. Gasping, he dragged himself upright. The horse was gone, swallowed by the storm. There was nothing for it but to walk one step at a time, snow to his thighs, the wind tearing at him. Back in the cabin, Eleanor fought to control her breathing. She spread the linens near the fire, her body shaking with each wave of pain. Sweat dampened her hairline despite the cold. The blizzard howled against the walls, drowning out her cries. Hours blurred into one another. Pain breath, pain again. And then suddenly, another sound cut through the storm's rage, the sharp, thin cry of a newborn. Eleanor gathered the tiny, slippery body into her arms, wrapping it in a soft yellow blanket. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed her lips to his damp forehead. "My boy," she whispered, rocking him as the wind screamed outside. But her joy was threaded with fear. Clayton hadn't come. The storm was only growing worse, and she was more alone than she had ever been, except now she wasn't just fighting for herself. The blizzard roared around the cabin, each gust slamming into the walls as if trying to rip them apart. Inside, Eleanor sat near the fire, her newborn son bundled in the yellow knit blanket. She rocked him gently, listening to his soft breaths, her own heart beating fast with equal parts wonder and worry. Clayton was still out there. Out in the storm, Clayton pushed forward through the waist-deep snow, every step a battle. His soaked clothes clung to him like ice, and the pain in his shoulder screamed with every movement. The cold had seeped into his bones, numbing his fingers and stealing his breath. Still he pressed on, guided by the faint, stubborn thought, "She needs me." At last, through the white blur, he saw it, the faint golden glow of lamplight through a crack in the cabin's shutters. Relief hit him so hard it almost dropped him to his knees. Stumbling forward, he reached the porch and pounded on the door. The knock was faint at first, then stronger. Eleanor froze. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it. Then it came again. She carefully set the baby in a makeshift cradle, a woven basket lined with blankets, and moved to the door. When she opened it, the wind shoved inside, along with the man standing on her threshold. Clayton's coat was thick with snow, his face pale beneath the frost clinging to his beard, a smear of blood on his shoulder. "Clayton." Her voice broke. He stepped inside and nearly collapsed to his knees in front of the fire. Steam rose from his coat as the heat began to thaw him. His breathing was ragged, but his gaze moved immediately toward the cradle. When he saw the baby, a tired but genuine smile spread across his face. "Looks like you've already built a family, Miss Sullivan," he murmured, voice hoarse but warm. "Mind if I join?" Eleanor felt something rise in her chest, not just relief, but something deeper. "Only if you're sure. Never been more sure." She lifted the baby from the cradle and placed him in Clayton's arms. His large, rough hands trembled not from weakness now, but from the weight of the tiny life nestled there. The baby stirred a small fist curling around his finger. For a long moment, the storm outside was just a distant howl. Inside, there was only the crackle of the fire, the steady breathing of 3 people, and the quiet realization that something had shifted. Eleanor watched him, her guard lowering in a way it never had before. For the first time in months, she felt the truth settle in her bones. She was no longer alone. The first sign of spring in Montana wasn't flowers. It was the soft give of the earth underfoot, the mud sucking lightly at boots where ice had ruled for months. The air smelled different, too. Pine warming in the sun, the faint dampness of thawing soil. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch with a wooden bucket in hand. Thomas swaddled against her chest in a linen sling. The breeze was still crisp, but it carried a promise. She pulled her shawl tighter and watched Clayton in the yard. He was kneeling beside a freshly dug hole, driving a sturdy post into the soft ground. His hammer swung with an easy rhythm. When he noticed her, he straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Soil's ready," he called. "We can start on the new kitchen." She smiled faintly. "Maybe the ground knows we've got work to do." Clayton grinned. "We'll need the space especially for a boy who's growing faster every day." He stepped closer, brushing a gentle hand over Thomas's cheek before turning back to his measurements. That afternoon, the golden light poured through the cabin windows as Eleanor sat at the table with a sheet of pale blue stationery, a scrap from her father's old writing set. The words were steady in her mind, but her hand trembled slightly as she wrote. "To the Boston Law Office. This is my official request for a legal divorce from Charles Whitmore." Her pen paused only briefly before signing her name. She folded the letter and sealed it with wax. Clayton stepped inside, just then sawdust clinging to his shirt, the faint smell of fresh-cut pine clinging to him. He spotted the letter immediately. "You did it." Eleanor nodded. "The last piece of the past. I'll send it on the next mail coach to town." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'm proud of you. They didn't celebrate with rings or a preacher. That evening they had stew with the Kowalskis and a few trusted neighbors. Lanterns swayed from the porch beams as the sky turned lavender. When the bowls were empty and the fire crackled low, Clayton stood and took her hand. "She's the strongest woman I've ever known," he said simply. "I thought I was coming here to help her, but she saved me." Eleanor smiled. No rings, but plenty of roots. The guests raised tin cups and a quiet toast. No one asked for documents out here. Love was proven in stacked firewood and shared bread, not signatures. A week later, Eleanor found Clayton attaching the handle to the new kitchen door. It was a horseshoe, polished smooth and bolted firm. "Found it bent near the pasture," he said. "Thought it was scrap, but it just needed reshaping." She traced the curve with her fingertips. "Like some people." He met her eyes and nodded. Broken things can still carry weight if they're strong enough. The Montana sunset spilled gold across the open plain, painting the distant peaks in firelight and laying long, warm shadows over the cabin's porch. Inside, the scent of simmering stew mingled with the quiet crackle of logs in the hearth. Thomas slept peacefully in the cradle Clayton had built his tiny chest, rising and falling in an easy rhythm. At the small wooden table by the window, Eleanor smoothed a sheet of her father's old blue stationery. She hesitated for only a moment before dipping her pen in ink and beginning to write. "Dear Pa, you once told me a home isn't a place, it's a feeling. I didn't believe you then. I thought a home was solid walls to keep out the wind, a roof to stop the rain, and a door that shut against the cold. Now I know better. I built this cabin with my own hands, log by log, beam by beam. I hauled wood-fought storms and prepared for a child with nothing but my grit. I did it for me and for Thomas. Then one day, a stubborn cowboy rode into my clearing with dusk in his eyes and a heart as steady as the land itself. He didn't come to rescue me. He came to build with me. And somehow between the snow and the silence, this cabin became something more than shelter. It became a home. And I'm not alone anymore. Love, your Eleanor. She folded the letter and placed it in the old tin mailbox outside. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. In the yard, Clayton was straightening a fence post, his shoulders relaxed in the fading light. Eleanor stepped toward him, Thomas resting against her shoulder. He looked up as she approached, and his smile was slow but certain. The world around them was still the kind of stillness that comes not from emptiness, but from everything being in its right place. In the distance, a wolf's cry rose and faded into the hills, but here there was only the sound of Thomas's quiet breaths and the low thud of Clayton's hammer. If you've made it to this moment in their story, if your chest tightened when Eleanor fought the storm alone, if you recognized yourself in Clayton's quiet vow, "I won't lose you too," then you already understand. Love in the Wild West was never given. It was built from pine beams and calloused hands from sleepless nights, and unspoken prayers from scars no one mentioned, unless someone stayed long enough to listen. If you believe love can outlast law loss and winter itself, then stay with us here at Wildmercyrides, where bullets may miss, but hearts never do. Winter in Montana has a way of sharpening every sound. The ring of a hammer on wood, the moan of wind through pine needles, the heavy silence after hard words are spoken. Eleanor knew that silence well. She felt it the morning Victoria Morrison's carriage rolled away, leaving her on the porch with a chill that cut deeper than the air. The cold could be fought with fire and blankets. The doubt Victoria left behind was harder to shake. But then came the night Clayton returned after the blizzard, his coat crusted with snow, his face drawn and pale. When he looked at Thomas, still red and squalling in his mother's arms, there was no hesitation, no flicker of second thoughts. Only a weary, relieved smile and a simple question. "Mind if I join?" Eleanor remembered how her walls shifted that night. She'd built them high and strong out of necessity, but sometimes a wall didn't need tearing down. It only needed a door. And Clayton, soaked to the bone, half frozen, had somehow found it. There were other moments, quieter, but no less powerful. Like the afternoon in early spring, when Clayton handed her the horseshoe-turned door handle. It was nothing fancy, just old iron reshaped and smoothed by his own hands. But when Eleanor traced its curve, she felt the truth in it. Some things bent by hardship could still hold weight. Some things, like people, became stronger for having been remade. Or the evening she wrote to her father the words that had lived unspoken in her chest for months, finally finding their way to the page. She hadn't realized how heavy her solitude had been until she could put it into a sentence. "I'm not alone anymore." And then there was Thomas's first laugh. It came without warning, a bubbling little sound that filled the cabin more completely than the crackle of the fire ever had. Clayton had been outside mending a fence, and he stopped mid-swing of his hammer, looking up with a startled grin when the sound reached him. Eleanor stood in the doorway, Thomas in her arms, smiling in a way she hadn't in years. Their story wasn't one of sweeping romance in grand ballrooms or declarations shouted in the rain. It was a slow build, like the cabin itself. Beam laid upon beam, trust placed upon trust. Every shared chore, every unasked question answered with quiet action every time they chose to stand beside each other. Instead of walking away, all of it had made something unshakable. By the time spring settled over the valley, Eleanor knew she had more than a roof over her head. She had a home, And for someone who had once believed she'd face every storm alone, that was the truest kind of miracle.